Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I'm Palestinian from Gaza. I would like to welcome you to this session, conversation with Helena Cobban, a book launch event of the newly released book, Understanding Hamas and Why It Matters. This event is organized by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney, and I want to acknowledge the help that we got from Free Palestine Melbourne and other organizations across Australia to help promoting this national important event. I am delighted today to be in conversation with Helena Cobban. Unfortunately, Rami Khouri is unable to join us today. However, he has recorded a video message for us, and we'll play the video in a bit. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, on which we are all dialing in today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. This land is a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I'm dialing in from Camaragal country. I want to welcome again. I am delighted to be joined with Helena Cobban. Helena is a writer. Helena is also a researcher on international affairs who lives in Washington, D.C. In 1984, Cambridge UP published Helena's seminal study, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. 3 of Helena's 6 other sole-authored books dealt with political and strategic developments in the Arab-Israeli theater. In 2010, she founded Just World Books, which is an incredible resource, which has published groundbreaking titles by Palestinian, Zionism questioning, Jewish, and other authors. In 2016, she was a co-founder of Just World Education, which she now serves as president. Her current main writing platform is globalities.org. I want to introduce Rami Khouri's bio, but first I really want to welcome Helena and thank you for joining us all the way from New York or Washington, D.C., I think. It's a bit blurry for me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ahmed, and to everybody who's here, because this is a really important topic to talk about. I'm actually in Washington, D.C., which is the unceded land of the Piscataways, and I've had the pleasure and honor of meeting with some Piscataway leaders here.
Yeah, yes, you are very welcome. Thank you so much, Helena. As I mentioned, Rami Khouri could not be with us today, but I'll play his recorded video, which is pretty important as well. Rami Khouri is a Palestinian-American academic and journalist whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Nazareth. During his 50-year career in journalism, he was managing director of the Jordan Times and the Daily Star Beirut newspapers, and contributed reporting and opinion pieces from the Middle East to the Financial Times, NPR, BBC Radio, and other outlets. He founded and managed the Essam Fairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, the IFI, at the American University in Beirut. He has been a Harvard Nieman Journalist Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a Fellow of the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs in Arab East Jerusalem. He is currently a Distinguished Fellow at the IFI, a Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., a regular contributor to Al Jazeera Online, and a member of the Just World Education Board. His interviews and writings can be found on Twitter, or X, former Twitter, at Rami Khouri. By way of introducing us to this discussion, on October the 7th, I mean, this is the elephant in the room whenever Palestine conversation comes up, hundreds of Palestinian resistance fighters led by Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of the Palestinian Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, have breached the $22 million fortified fence around the Gaza Strip and entered areas of Israeli control, breaking the then 16-year-old siege. The operation triggered the most lethal military operation against Gaza, a genocidal campaign, resulting in tens, if not hundreds of thousands Palestinian killed, injured, and a complete annihilation of the basic infrastructure in Gaza, a small strip of land, 360 square kilometers with a population of 2.3 million, a small strip of land that was declared uninhabitable by the UN in 2020. More than a year now, with unspeakable, unimaginable atrocities committed in Gaza by the Israeli occupation forces day in and day out. And much of the mainstream media coverage of the dire situation in Gaza and the analysis following the events that took place on October the 7th have been marred with propaganda, false narratives, and diversions from the wider context of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. The problem is when such an anti-colonial resistance movement like Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization, unjustly to my understanding, much of the accusations and twisted narratives around Hamas and around the Palestinian struggle becomes palatable and reasonable to a certain extent for public consumption in the Western society. So to that end, it's imperative, it becomes very imperative to have an objective discussions about the Palestinian organization or other organizations like Hamas, its history, strategies, end goals, and its connection to the wider fold of the Palestinian resistance against colonization. We had many conversations prior to today's session with subject matter experts like Khalid Hiroub and Tariq Baqauni. Noura Riqat as well talked about the international law, how it sees anti-colonial struggle. I really encourage everyone to check it out on YouTube, on our channel on YouTube, Palestine Justice Movement Sydney. So I want to start, Helena, again, I want to welcome you. I really want to start by, before playing the intro that Rami Khouri prepared for us, I want to start by asking you this question. Why did you and Rami embark on this journey of writing the book? I mean, why do you think it's important? And how is this particular book is different from the other books that are present in the market now?
So yeah, I'm delighted if you've had Khalid Hiroub and Tariq Baqauni on, but our book started not as a sort of research project, but as a public information project, which is really what Just World Educational does here in the United States, mainly in North America, but also globally. And we knew that there were lots of great books that are kind of academic type studies, historical studies, political science studies, sociological studies, or whatever, that look at Hamas, I mean, back to practically the origins of the organization. My friend Dr. Ziad Abu Amr wrote an excellent book about the Islamist movements in Palestine. So our organization, this organization that I'm president of, and Rami is on our board, we decided at our board meeting in March that really, you know, there is such intense demonization of this movement, Hamas, whose full name is the Islamic Resistance Movement, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, that it was really hard for people, even people in the sort of progressive anti-war movement here in North America, to do the political work that is needed in order to push for a ceasefire, to push for an arms embargo, to push for meaningful negotiations to end the occupation of Gaza and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories, so long as this name, this H word, this Hamas, or as you know, when when the Israelis say it, they often say Hamas, you know, and it makes it even more terrifying, of course. But I shouldn't mock them. I mean, I have some good Hebrew-speaking friends who are in the anti-war movement, and they say Hamas, and I always giggle a little bit because, anyway, the demonization has been so intense that even people in the progressive movement in this country don't want to even think about the politics or diplomacy of ending the struggle, ending the occupation, because they fear that if they get, you know, if they start to talk about the H word, then that somehow delegitimizes everything else they have to say about the humanitarian crisis, about the genocide, you know, about the scores of thousands of women and children who are being killed in Gaza. So we thought, look, we just have to do some public education around this issue. So the title of the book, actually, it's Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. It's the understanding that matters. It's also Hamas that matters, but for us, it's the understanding that matters. You know, people need to understand this movement. They don't have to agree with it, you know, but if you're going to do diplomacy, including citizen diplomacy, with an urgent goal of ending a genocide, ending an occupation, then you have to know who the resistance movement is. And of course, there have been mountains of disinformation poured upon the organization. Stories of, you know, 40 burned babies in Israel on October 7th, or mass rapes, or, you know, all this disinformation. And then there is a lot of, I would say, misinformation. Like, you know, people say Hamas is just the same as ISIS. So then you don't want to stand up and say, well, I think we ought to negotiate with Hamas, or, you know, really let's push for negotiations with this movement, because ISIS is a very different kind of a movement that slaughters anybody who is not, you know, who doesn't agree with them. They slit the throats of Christians in Syria. They oppress women in a terrible way. And there are so many ways in which Hamas, as a broadly based and religiously anchored social and political movement, is different from ISIS. People in the progressive anti-war movement here in the United States, and also, I imagine, there in Australia, need to understand. And that's what matters, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned diplomacy. I mean, something that is unknown about the movement as well, that is, it has attempted many times to engage with diplomacy and, you know, peacefully protesting the blockade, trying to resolve the situation politically and diplomatically. But it's always been rejected by the occupation. And someone once said, I can't remember who it was, but he said, you know why Israel is not engaging with Hamas? It's because they know they can, you know, negotiate. They have the appetite to actually engage politically with the occupation, and that's mainly why they don't want to engage with them, and they refuse every unity government that Hamas is part of.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in terms of the record of negotiations, this time 1 year ago, there were successful negotiations brokered by my government here in the United States with the help of Qatar and Egypt, negotiations with Hamas over a 4-day ceasefire that would allow for the release of many hostages. And it was so successful in that first 4 days that then they extended it by a further 2 days and then a further 1 day. So it was a total of sort of 3 mini ceasefires. And then the process broke down, primarily because the Israeli side didn't want to negotiate anymore. And, you know, but those were successful negotiations. So we need to remember that, as well as the many other earlier ceasefire negotiations that have occurred at the earlier bouts of Israeli assaults against Gaza from 2009 onwards.
Absolutely. I mean, and the close observer of the organization itself, it can easily see that there's much to the movement and to the organization than what the mainstream media organizations are propagating. And this is the beauty and the importance of this book, because it's like an amalgamation of many viewpoints, you know, a number of subject matter experts who have specialized in Hamas from different lenses, and it's an accumulation of all that knowledge in the book.
So yeah, we designed the webinar series, which the book is based on 5 webinars that we held back in May. I can't, in May. I think we did all of them in May, with these 5 experts on Hamas, and we structured the series of 5 webinars to be kind of incremental and so that each one, in a sense, built on the other, the preceding ones. So I think we've had fabulous feedback both to the webinars and to the book, which is largely the transcripts of these 5 webinars, because people who are not subject matter experts say it really kind of takes you through, so that by the end you feel you have a much richer understanding of the politics and internal dynamics and the values and mission of Hamas than you would if you just listened to the mainstream media.
Absolutely. I mean, those videos were just brilliant and just very eye-openers, really, especially that interview that you did with Yaron Gunning. He's an expert on terrorism, and he's a head of some sort of a division at his university. So it was pretty engaging series, I would say. I would like to play Rami's message right now, and then we can continue our conversation, Helena.
Hello and good day to everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, as I'd like to be, but Helena is going to keep you pretty well informed. And I want to just add a few points about why I think this book is important and why we did it, and whether there's 1 or 2 key points about Hamas that you want to keep in mind. This whole process of the transformation of the Middle East and relations between the Arab countries and Palestinians and Iran and Israel and the US, and all this stuff keeps changing, and the war drums keep getting louder and louder. They're not just drums, they're actual war manifestations. The reason that this book is worth reading is because it is the work of 5 really serious scholars who have lived with Palestinians in Gaza for years, interviewed all the key players, know them personally, and it's a very rare source of empirical evidence based on a real on-the-ground research and personal contacts that gives you insights into Hamas that you would not get anywhere else. But Hamas itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is how Hamas reflects the wider Palestinian national sentiment, and how Hamas has been, over the years, the permanent repository of both the values and sentiments and aspirations of Palestinians, but also their pragmatism in trying to address how do we get out of the war and the occupation and all the stuff that's going on into a situation of serious negotiations aiming for a permanent resolution that is based on equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians and other involved parties like the Syrians and Lebanese. How do we make that historic transition? Hamas is misunderstood, and I don't support many of the things that Hamas does, whether it's some of their social policies or some of their militancy, including some of the terrorism that they've done over the years. But to be fair, every actor in this process, the Israelis, the Americans, the other Arabs, the Syrians, the Lebanese, they've all done a little bit of everything. None of us are guilt-free. But the important thing about Hamas is that they have maintained a position on the political requirements for a just and permanent resolution. They've maintained that position for decades and decades. They're the only Palestinian group that has articulated that position, which reflects the wider Palestinian consensus, and at the same time taken action to make the resistance in their name, the resistance, Islamic resistance movement. They've made resistance a verb, not just an abstract noun. They resist, and they resist in various ways, and one of them is by using arms. And the outcome is very complex and often, as we've seen recently in Gaza, really painful for Palestinians. But they are important for that reason, that they do reflect the national consensus. The other point I want to make about Hamas is how their decision-making works. This is not, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where one person has all the power, makes all the decisions, and getting rid of that person changes the entire situation. Hamas is a group that has evolved over the last 4 decades in terms of its organizational structure, its decision-making, its consultation system, its internal elections. It's a very sophisticated mechanism. Hezbollah is very similar to Lebanon, to Hamas, but they both put a lot of emphasis on reaching decisions through a very consultative process among their different component elements, including the prisoners and Israeli jails. And once they reach the consensus, they have a policy that represents all of Hamas and tends to represent all of Palestinians. That's why they're important to talk to them. But a related point to that is that the positions that Hamas has taken over the years have almost always reflected a pragmatic willingness to negotiate an end to the conflict. Of course, the terms that Hamas expects as all Palestinian people would include implementing UN resolutions and international law, ending the occupation, removing the settlements or exchanging settlements for other land. In other words, equal justice from both sides simultaneously, not the old Oslo process approach of the Palestinians get a little bit here, and then if they behave, they might get a little bit more. There's got to be equal justice simultaneously respected by all. And they have at least 10 times in the last 30, 40 years sent messages, sent letters, spoken in public about coexisting with the state of Israel under conditions that give the Palestinians the same national rights, sovereignty, security, and opportunities that the Israelis already have as a recognized state. So they're not people who just go and make war and want to kill Israelis. They are people who do resistance for the purpose of triggering a political resolution ultimately. And this is a complex set of emotions and activities that most people in the Western world who rely for their views about Hamas on the mainstream media have no idea about. This is an alien world for most people in the West, except for a few scholars and experts here and there. But this is why this book is important, because it really shows you what Hamas feels, who they represent, how they reach their positions and what they're aspiring for. And even with all of the violence and tragedy of the last year or more, they still maintain that position. And when Sinwar was assassinated, when he was killed on the battlefield, it is unlike what you hear from the White House or mainstream media on the West. This is not a game changer that's going to suddenly open up opportunities for peacemaking, because Sinwar was elected through a very consultative process, and before him, other Hamas leaders were assassinated. He's the fourth one to be assassinated now or killed, and the process could. Goes on, and in fact, what happens is we've seen it with Hezbollah and Hamas. When you assassinate the leader, the organization is anticipating that and is prepared to quickly keep moving with its strategy that is one that represents the sentiments of the majority of all their members. So Sinwar's death is not a big game changer. We will have new leaders appointed. Hamas has been hurt badly by the war, by the genocide, and the process of how Hamas reorganizes and reemerges in a political form or military form, we don't know. This is to be seen in the future. So it's important to understand the principles that Hamas stands for, and to understand that they are a reflection of overall Palestinian sentiment, and I would say of overall global sentiment. People all over the world who support Palestinian rights would have no problem with the position that Hamas has led out. The problem is that people in the West, especially, in the media especially, and political people have never taken the 5 minutes they need to listen to some of these statements and talk to some of these people who are involved. And I think we're going to probably reach a point soon where, just as the United States fought with the Viet Cong and then negotiated with them, fought with the Taliban and then negotiated with them, created wars in Iraq and got involved in wars in Somalia and Libya, and creating huge messes in all of these places. The U.S. will change its policy. The West of the Aid will ultimately have to sit down and talk to people. It's not Hamas, other groups that emerge that represent the same view that Hamas represents. So those are the quick points I wanted to make. And Helena will fill you in on the details and explain more of these and add other points that you should know. But we're really grateful that you're attending this event. And we promise to keep providing you with any insights that we can in the years to come.
That was very interesting speech by Rami. I mean, he mentioned many things about Hamas that the public might find a bit difficult to kind of grapple with, you know, words like pragmatism, diplomacy. So, I mean, my question to you, I mean, for you, Helena, when you started this investigation, I mean, what were your findings? I mean, were there anything that you know, didn't know about the movement that you've discovered out of this conversation that kind of gave you that like aha moment that, you know, people are currently unaware of?
There were many wonderful insights that we got from this process. I have to say, going into it, I knew a lot more about Hamas than probably most people, well, definitely than most people here in the United States, because, you know, back from the late 1980s, I was interviewing Hamas leaders and activists at many levels in Gaza. And then I would go back periodically. The most recent time, I think I actually was able to interview some Hamas leaders in Damascus, shortly before they left Damascus in 2011, and in Beirut. And I was in Gaza right after the elections, the very important elections in which they participated in January 2006, free and fair elections in which they participated completely, peaceably, and they won the elections, as was certified by the Carter Center here in the United States and by the EU mission and all kinds of people. So right after that, I rushed, I have to say, to Gaza to do some interviewing, and was able to spend some time not just with the newly elected parliamentarians there in Gaza City, but also with Hamas women activists, 4 of whom had been elected on the Hamas ticket in the parliamentary elections. That's just one little way in which it's clear that Hamas is not ISIS. First of all, well, 2 ways. That they participate in elections, peacefully and freely and fairly, and they run women candidates, and they have women leaders. They have women. One of these women, Dr. Jamila Shanti, became a minister in the Hamas government. She was assassinated by the Israelis, I believe, last December. But I went to with some of these Hamas women to the kindergartens that they were running, for example, in some of the refugee camps in Gaza. I had all these sort of preconceptions that Islamist pedagogy is just, the kids sit there kind of nodding backwards and forwards and doing rote learning of the Quran or something. These kindergartens were a hive of activity. It was very interactive learning with a lot of little games and, some computer games, and just, really excellent pedagogy. I come from a family of teachers, so I definitely recognize that. So I did come into this process of the webinars with my own background in having met many of these people at all levels of Hamas. But it was a real pleasure and an honor to have these 5 conversations with people who have dug deeper than I was able to when I was doing mainly journalistic kind of inquiries. I think my 2 or 3 main takeaways were, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Jeroen Gunning, he is one of the co-founders of this whole field of academic study called critical terrorism studies. And, the moment I heard about it from Jeroen, I was like, yes, of course you need something. A whole academic field is required to criticize and interact objectively with this massive field of terrorism studies that we have here in Washington, D.C. in spades. And I'm sure you have, many centers of terrorism studies there in Australia as well. And it's all, in essence, built on othering people with whom you disagree. And Jeroen, in our conversation on the webinar that's in the book, he gives a very rich history of the use of these othering techniques, specifically in late colonial campaigns against national independence movements. And for me, I grew up in England in the 1950s, when the newspapers and the public sphere were all full of the Mau Mau in Kenya. They're so scary. They take a special oath. They do these things that are very scary. So back then, terrorism as such was not the same kind of big buzzword that it became after September 11th. But I as soon as Jeroen was talking about this specific use of sort of dehumanizing and othering labels that are put on national independence movements, it rang a bell for me. Yes, that's exactly what I was subjected to growing up in England. And of course, the day came when the Governor General, the British Governor General of Kenya, in his, silly little, I shouldn't mock them, but really, you know, wearing these shorts that the British governors general would all wear. I think they wear them in Australia, maybe still till today. I don't know, maybe. But, you know, he was there at the flagpole, and he was hauling down the Union Jack and hauling up the flag of the independent country of Kenya, shaking hands with Jomo Kenyatta, who had been a leader of the Mau Mau. So, you know, and maybe 3 weeks earlier, he'd been in jail. So that is how, you know, I saw decolonization unfolding week after week in country after country in that period of the 1950s and 1960s. So here we have what you could call a frozen situation of not yet realized decolonization in Palestine. Just, you know, miserable suffering, but suffering that is very, very familiar to all the peoples of the previously colonized countries, whether or the indigenous peoples of, you know, your country and mine in Australia and here and in New Zealand and Canada. So I think Jeroen's kind of framing of this as a sort of late colonial discourse that needs to be unpacked was really helpful. I think, well, Dr. Paula Caridi and Dr. Khalid Haroub both gave a lot of really wonderful details about Hamas's internal decision making. I mean, I have sat with a group of Hamas leaders a couple of times in Damascus back in the day, and you see a kind of collegiality amongst them. And they defer to each other. It's not, you know, it's not a rigidly hierarchical organization. So that, you know, the leadership organization in Hamas is called the Shura Council, which means consultation. And I have seen that in action, but Dr. Paula and Dr. Khalid both gave a lot more kind of details about how those decisions are made. Then, you know, we had obviously Dr. No, the one who is not a doctor, the one who has not published a book on Hamas, Ma'in Rabbani, who's an old friend of mine, a wonderful analyst of Palestinian politics. He gave some brilliant analyses of Hamas's relations, both with the rest of the axis of resistance and with the other Palestinian movements, that I thought was really helpful. Then the last session that we had, the fifth of the chapters in the book, was with Dr. Azam Tamimi, who is close to the Hamas leadership. So I thought it was really important. We brought in 3 of our other board members from Just World Educational to really ask him what we thought were the hard questions. You know, what were they trying to do on October 7th? And, you know, what do they think about women's rights and LGBTQ rights? And, you know, he gave us the best, most honest and most thoughtful answers that he could. They weren't all of them answers that we liked, especially, I have to say, the one on LGBTQ rights. He said, we don't have that problem in Palestinian society. But, you know, right now, honestly, I mean, I hear this from even many of my gay Palestinian friends. Now is not the time to raise that issue. You know, it's a diversion from the matter of the genocide. Once the genocide and the occupation are ended, then we can talk about a whole range of social rights. But now is not the time. But, you know, I thought it was really excellent to have Dr. Azam Tamimi there with a broad range, well, you know, 5 of us board members from Just World Ed asking questions from our point of view. So I was learning definitely in every single session. And so those are the 5 chapters in the book. And then we also put in 6 appendices that I think, you know, are documents that people will find useful. And I hope that even people who are not specialists will find much of interest and use in those appendices.
Yes, thanks, Helena. This is a really great review of your main findings of the book. I just wanted to pick up on a point that you mentioned about the strategies of Hamas regarding the LGBT community, and it's being progressive. I like how Abdel Jawad Omar, how he described it in his piece on Mondo Wise, talking about progressive and regressive within the confines of the current colonial struggle. I mean, is resistance regressive or progressive in that case? So I think there's a difference of that concept in the West and in Palestine right now within the context of colonization. I mean, being progressive is to be outspoken and face the occupation, while regressive is to capitulate and go with the occupation, like some parties. I don't want to mention names, but PA, for example, I did mention names. But yeah, so it's a great important point to emphasize, because we get that sentiment in the West a lot.
Yeah, I think Abdel Jawad Omar's work has been brilliant, both in Mondoweiss and elsewhere. We do have a little bibliography at the back of our book, and his article in Mondoweiss is certainly there. I think there has been this reluctance in the progressive movement in this country to support Hamas's right to resist, because the Zionists have been so successful in painting Hamas as being either exactly like ISIS or just terribly socially regressive. And neither of those things is true.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I do want to encourage everyone to start putting in their questions. We're going to start taking questions shortly. But before we start, I really want to have this question. We mentioned the history of Palestinian resistance, talking about armed resistance as well. We have a wealth of rich history of Palestinian resistance, talking about the PLO, we're talking about the PFLP, we're talking about the DLP. You've written a book also about the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I'm just wondering, I mean, I had a conversation with Tariq Baqani the other day, and he described Hamas as just a continuation. Hamas just, just got the mantle from the previous organizations and continued on this path of resistance. I mean, and he mentioned the only difference was just this Islamic garb that Hamas is actually packaging itself, or its ideological resistance concepts in. Did you see any other differences between Hamas and the PLO, for example, in their struggle against this Zionist project?
Oh, many differences. And I would be wary of saying it's exactly a straight line, from the PLO to Hamas. So, the kind of the basis of Palestinian armed resistance is Izzeddin al-Qassam himself in the 1930s, when he came and organized basically the peasantry against British colonial presence and against the Zionist presence. And that's why, today the Hamas military is called the Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades. They hark very directly back to Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was killed by the British. And the British had developed so many counter-terrorism kind of policies to repress that Arab uprising, that Palestinian uprising in the 1930s, many of which are still on the books in Israel and are used by the Israeli occupation today. So then when you had the emergence of Fatah, which is the major organization within the PLO, many of those original founders of Fatah had come out of a kind of an Islamist background. Yasser Arafat, Salah Khalaf, Abu Jihad, Khalil al-Wazir. So two important things there. They started organizing in Gaza. Gaza has always been the crucible of Palestinian resistance organizing. primarily because it is a location within historic Palestine that has a massive concentration of Palestinian refugees from 1948. So when Abu Iyad and Abu Ammar and Abu Jihad started organizing in the 1950s, in the kind of immediate, let's say, post-Nakba era, they started off with a kind of an Islamist tinge, a definite strong Islamist tinge to what they were doing. But this was a time of kind of secularism in the global anti-colonial movement. And then you had the emergence of their brother organizations, the Jabhat Sha'biya and the Jabhat Demokratiya, both of which were founded by Palestinian Christians and were avowedly secular. So when Fatah went into kind of coalition with them, then that's when they adopted, let's say, the slogan of a secular democratic state as being their goal. Whereas Hamas never did that. Hamas says that their goal is a singular democratic state, but not a secular one. And actually, Azam Tamimi, when he was talking with us, had a very strong critique of secularism as something that was an import from the West. So, you know, definitely a good discussion, but a different worldview. And I want to say that the suffering that the people in Gaza have been going through for many years now, but most specifically in the last 13 months, I think their strong religious belief has helped them withstand that suffering, has given them a form of samud, of resilience, that I'm not sure any secular ideology would do. Maybe a communist ideology, you know. I mean, the people of South Vietnam, North Vietnam went through horrible suffering under first the French and then the American bombardments and strategic hamlets and all those, you know, counterterrorism things that were done to them. And they, you know, just held on to their nationalist and to a large extent communist. I mean, you need to have very strong beliefs, I think is what I want to say, in order to have that resilience. In the case of Fatah, Fatah was never so well organized. And it's always been prone to corruption and that you just don't see in Hamas. I would note, I think it's important to note that in Gaza and in the West Bank, the resistance movements that are generally led by Hamas, it's a coalition that also includes the Jabhat Sha'biya, the Popular Front and the Democratic Front and the secularists, as well as the Al-Aqsa brigades, which are nominally loyal to Fatah. So, you know, Fatah is this kind of weird thing that is all over the place, whereas I think Hamas has much more internal discipline, much less corruption than Fatah. And then, of course, this lack of internal discipline in Fatah and the PLO and their openness to corruption is what has allowed them to stay in the Oslo process for, what is it, 30 years now. I mean, it's an outrage that a quisling body can stay in power thanks to, you know, American funding, American arms, American political support. I mean, they have been acting like the capos or the quislings of the Israeli occupation since 1994. So, you know, that is a big difference.
Absolutely. I mean, Fatah has the creation of the PA out of Fatah was meant to have that, you know, governance that works with the occupation to maintain the governed for the occupation rather than to, you know, to save them, you know, money, to save them all the resources that they might need to spend. And, you know, talking about the Hamas as a nationalistic movement, you know, enveloped in this Islamic garb, and I think the steadfastness that we're seeing, it's a testament to the long history of Hamas before they adopted the armed struggle, which is rich in building that virtuous Islamic society in Gaza before really kind of being jolted into this armed struggle against occupation in the first Intifada in 1987. And so there's a lot into Hamas's history, and there's like I said, there's a lot of differences between Hamas and Fatah. Like I said, the Oslo peace process was actually created to stay as a process. It never was meant to have any outcome. And we can see that 30 years on now. I want to turn into the question. There's an interesting question about Hamas that compares it with Iran. How similar is Hamas to the founding leaders in the groups that became the government of Islamic Republic of Iran? As we have seen in Iran, many liberal transformations into education and women's rights, they never materialized in Hamas. So what are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I don't know enough about the revolutionary organizing of Khomeini and his colleagues in the Iranian diaspora under the Shah to be able to make a comparison. I would note that obviously Iran, like all the other countries and members of the axis of resistance in West Asia, has been subjected to, a lot of disinformation and misinformation in the Western media. And it's worth noting that although there are obviously, limits on women's civil and political rights in Iran, still women in Iran, have a very full opportunity to participate in education, in business, in the professions. It's, again, Iran is not like the Taliban. It's a modern form of an Islamic society. But I really don't know enough about the politics. Obviously, at the beginning, after the fall of the Shah, there was the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which emerged in the first instance as a leftist opposition to the Ayatollahs, but then got co-opted by the West, and the remnants of the Mujahideen al-Khalq are now, proteges of the West in some kind of a camp in Albania. It's a kind of a sad story for them, I would say. But yeah, there are evident differences politically and theologically between the Hamas leaders, who are Sunni and believe in, this concept of a Shura type inclusive leadership, whereas the Shia model of leadership is much more hierarchical, that, you'd have somebody who is your source of inspiration, and then you follow him, and then you end up with 13 ayatollahs or whatever, and the Supreme Guidance Council. That's a very hierarchical form of organization. Hamas's form of organization is much more grassroots and responsible to the grassroots.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, talking about Hamas, I mean, I was in Gaza a month before the genocide, and I was visiting Gaza a number of times before that, and I could see the society. It's nothing like what the Western imagination has in mind, really. Women are wearing garbs and everything. It was pretty open. It was comparable to the cities in Jordan to a certain extent, or because it's part of that geographic depth, really. No rules or specific Islamic or Islamist conservative rules were imposed or anything. Women were able to go to cafes or restaurants, go out, and it was sort of an open with certain restrictions. I mean, not as open as the Western societies, I would say, but to that region. I mean, there are certain specifics to the regions that the Western societies are not just aware of or don't want to be aware of. So we always get these questions about Hamas. There's a question about Hamas talking about the events of Al-Aqsa flood, Operation October the 7th. So do you have any insight into how Hamas's view, the impact of their October the 7th attack was on a hindsight? Like, is there any, I don't know, sort of regret that, I mean, it's understandable that to my understanding, I don't think Hamas has anticipated this reaction of the occupation, this huge genocidal campaign, and the letdown of the regional area as well to their struggle. So what are your thoughts on that, Helena?
I certainly have not heard any regrets from anybody associated with Hamas, you know, that, gee, I wish we hadn't done that. Because they knew it was going to be a big operation. It was designed to be a big operation. It was designed primarily to capture military people from the ring of military bases with which Israel has surrounded Gaza since 1948. So it was obviously meticulously planned, as was the ability of the resistance, the armed resistance movement, to withstand any foreseeable Israeli military counterattack. And we can see how thorough those latter preparations have been in the fact that after 13 months of totally ferocious military assault on Gaza, the resistance is still active, still organizing, still has, you know, still is doing operations, and has not buckled or surrendered in any appreciable way. They are still there in their tunnels. I guess they got this idea of building tunnels primarily from Hezbollah, which had used them for a long time in Lebanon to build resilience for the fighting forces. And I think you have to say that Hamas's use of the tunnels for its fighters gives a whole new meaning to the term strategic depth, because usually strategic depth is like something, you know, you pull back. But in the case of the Qassam fighters and their allies from the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades and from Jihad al-Islami and the other movements, their strategic depth is vertical. They go down. And the Israelis have never been able to take out those tunnel systems. Having said that, their original goal, and Dr. Azam Tamimi talked about this, and it's also in this very important document that we include as an appendix here, which is a document that Hamas released in January explaining Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Their goal was to seize and capture as many military people as possible from this ring of military bases. And they were, I've said this a number of times, catastrophically successful. Catastrophically from the point of view of Israel, because actually the entire Israeli military command structure in the south of Israel collapsed. The Hamas fighters were able to take captive these leading officers in not only the Gaza brigade of the IDF, but also the Southern Command, which was in this, you know, I think that was the one that was in Raim, which is where the music festival was. So they just overran these military bases and took the military people. So the vast majority of the hostages who are still alive or dead, still in Gaza, are military officers and serving military people, including the young women who were military people. The ones who have been released, nearly all of them, I think maybe all of them, were the civilians. Mm. So with the collapse of that entire portion of Israel's defense, that was a catastrophe for Israel's entire strategic concept, which is one of like overwhelming deterrence. They had been proven incapable of deterring, you know, these, whatever it was, 13,000, 15,000 Hamas people from Gaza from overrunning their entire southern command. But it was also in doing that, obviously, that terrible ring of walls and fences that all of us who have been to Gaza have seen, that were used to enclose the concentration camp of Gaza. Those were breached in 30 or 40 different places. Essentially, they collapsed. So the people of Gaza, who have been in this concentration camp under siege, under tight siege for 17 years, poured out. You know, they who wouldn't? I mean, they actually did it once before. Was it in 2008 or sometime? They all poured out into Egypt when they were able to, and this time they poured out into Israel. And you know, they stole cars and they stole radios, and then they stole all kinds of stuff. You know, obviously they did, but they also, because they generally knew that, oh, the goal is to take hostages, because we, you know, Hamas's goal was to take hostages for use in potential prisoner exchange, like the Gilad Shalit one, but on steroids. But the hoi polloi, the riffraff of Gaza, who poured out of the concentration camp, thought, hayella, you know, let's go kidnap people and take them back to Gaza. And they did. So actually, it was chaos in terms of where those hostages were. And it took Hamas a lot of time when this time last year in November, when they had the hostage release during that 7-day ceasefire, to actually locate which clan, which family has 3 Israeli, you know, women, 4 old Israeli men, you know. They gathered them all up and they pulled them together and they released them. But obviously, in the course of that chaos, who knows? Like, there has never been a credible inquiry of any kind into the violations of international humanitarian law that occurred. We know that some Israeli military units pursued their so-called Hannibal doctrine and shot at anything that was moving, whether it was Palestinians from Gaza, Palestinian fighters from Gaza, or Israeli civilians. I mean, many Israeli civilians and possibly even some Israeli military people were killed by the Israeli military themselves. There were, you know, horrible things that happened, and we don't know who did them. But of course, they all got lumped under this Hamas are, you know, just a bunch of terrorist thugs. No, the Hamas fighters who went had very specific missions, and the fact that they were able to actually overrun these military bases and take these military captives, that was a big job. They didn't have time to go around, you know, raping and looting and you know, making trouble. That was generally, if it was done by Palestinians, it was not done by organized military formations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this great wealth of details. I mean, I did an interview with Asawan Stanley a couple of weeks ago, and Electronic Intifada documented all these propaganda released by the mainstream media about what happened actually on October the 7th. I really encourage everyone to go and look it up. It's on Palestine Justice Movement YouTube channel. And, you know, by the testament of the leadership in the Israeli army, they actually mentioned that Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was, or October the 7th, was actually a mass Hannibal, where the Israeli army actually killed tens, if not hundreds, of their own military soldiers and civilians in order to prevent them being taken captives and later on being exchanged with Palestinian captives who are in their thousands, really, in Israeli prisons. And Hamas also, in their kind of document that they released, that is part of this book, they actually mentioned all the details that, you know, mistakes were made. The main intention was to attack the military centers, and, you know, and by the Israeli army's testament as well, they mentioned that it was an incredibly successful operation, so that it was described as, you know, the command center around Gaza was overwhelmed, which is a word that is, you know, he says it sends the chills to my body whenever I hear it, you know. And that kind of deterrence that Israel has always maintained in the region has been really punctured by Hamas. And like you mentioned, Helena, Hamas was not the only group that was taken captives, because people thought actually Hamas was overwhelmed by how successful the operation was. And then they just continued and continued. And this is where things started to get wrong, and civilians and children were taken. But yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's also important that they have called for an independent international inquiry. And I think that that is a call that we should support, you know, because how many times has the Israeli military, you know, told us that they are investigating themselves? You know, we can't trust that process at all. And we can't trust any of these processes that are not, you know, undertaken by reputable independent international bodies. But of course, it gave the Israelis, it gave them, if you like, permission to launch the genocide, or they thought that it did, because they were so successful at painting, you know, not just the Hamas fighters, but all the people of Gaza as just these like subhuman beings. But of course, this is so familiar from like all these colonial campaigns. I mean, honestly, when I was 4 years old, I was terrified from something I'd been watching on the television. We didn't have television, so listening to on the radio in England in the 1950s, that the Red Indians were going to come and land on my lawn, like, you know, you somehow these colonial disinformation structures are extremely successful at spreading fear of the non-white peoples.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the colonizer-colonized relationship that always persists into the future. And, you know, we have Algeria, we have South Africa, we have Vietnam, we have all these records in history. I really encourage everyone, if they have any questions, to put it in. It's easier just to get the text in rather than someone to say their questions out loud. I see a hand there, so I really encourage whoever's hand that is to put your questions in the Q&A. So there's a question here. Hamas was elected democratically in 2006, but that was nearly 2 decades ago. I mean, have there been any elections since then? And, you know, if not, which is the case, what are the main reasons behind the lack of subsequent electoral, you know, processes inside Gaza or the Palestinian territories, for that matter?
So yes, this is actually an interesting question. There have been elections, but not national level parliamentary elections. That's what we had in January of 2006. It was a national level parliamentary election held under the general rubric of the Oslo process. So first of all, important to note that Hamas, which in the earlier parliamentary elections in 1996, did not run in the elections. In 2006, or rather 2005, when the elections were being prepared, they did decide to enter them, which was a significant step in terms of saying, okay, we can work with the Oslo process, you know, we're very happy to participate in these elections. Now, when you have nationwide elections of this nature, especially under some kind of international monitoring, you do actually gain some, political rights that normally under military occupation people don't have, especially, in the West Bank and Gaza, freedom of movement, freedom of expression. The Hamas people and all the other people who were running candidates in 2005, 2006 were able to take advantage of these elections, and then Hamas won them. So then we had the campaign by Israel and the United States to nullify the results of the election, in essence, which led to the tight siege on Gaza and the division between Gaza and the West Bank. So there have not been nationwide parliamentary elections since then, but there have been many elections for like university student unions or for professional organizations. And in as much as Fatah and Hamas, which are the two main organizations, political movements, have been able to agree, we've got student union elections in Birzeit University or in Najah University, here are the ground rules for how we will contest them. And those have been really interesting elections to look at. But you cannot just have elections for nothing. I mean, people in Western countries think elections are so wonderful. Let's just have elections. An election is always about something. So, if you're going to have a functioning PA legislative body, which is what was promised in January 2006, then we have elections for that. And here are the rules for how we fight the elections. But there has been no opportunity for those, either in the West Bank or in Gaza. So Hamas has reached out numerous times to Fatah. Please let us get back together under some form of a political umbrella. I think what the Hamas leaders would most like to do would be to enter the PLO, which earlier they didn't want to enter the PLO because they saw it as too secular. Now they want to enter the PLO, which is the recognized sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people globally. But Abu Mazen and his cronies, his aging band of cronies who run Fatah and are totally on the US-Israeli payroll, have always refused to let Hamas join the political process. I think particularly since Hamas's electoral victory in 2006. So interestingly, Hamas's sort of internal political program is still for a national unity government. They do not want to head this government. They have proposed numerous times that they want the long imprisoned Fatah leader Marwan Barghouti to head this government. But Fatah itself, Abu Mazen has refused and has not given Marwan Barghouti permission to proceed with this. And Fatah has resolutely kept Hamas out of the PLO. And it's, because the PLO has legitimacy globally.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, even in 2006, when Hamas ran into for the election, you mentioned they refused to be part of the election in 1996 because they said it's not secular enough, or it's not probably the best way to do it given its experience. But then in 2006, it was actually aiming to be part of a government, a wider government, that Hamas will be able to have an influence on the decision-making process for the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And it actually, again, surprised itself with a landslide win in the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, that's another instance of a catastrophic success, because it did lead to a catastrophe for them in terms of the siege of Gaza for the next 17 years.
Yes, absolutely. I've got the last two questions, if you don't mind, Helena, if that's okay. I don't want to take too much of your time. It's too late at night now where you are. So the question regarding Fatah in Gaza, what is the position or aim of Fatah in Gaza regarding their role moving forward? What is the size of Fatah political leadership in Gaza? And what are relationships with Hamas leadership like?
Honestly, I don't know enough about Fatah in Gaza right now. I know, that they have a presence there. Of the 10 universities that were in Gaza, 1 or 2 were clearly, generally pro Fatah, and 1 or 2 were clearly generally pro Hamas. I do know that there are units of Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade that are in a joint operations room with the Al Qassam brigades in Gaza. So they cooperate at the operational military level. They have to, obviously. So that's interesting. But beyond that, I really don't know enough about the political presence of Fatah in Gaza. And it's really hard, honestly, to find out about the political structure of Hamas in Gaza right now, given the horrendous assaults that the Israeli military has made on all the civilian governance structures in Gaza, including obviously the Gaza municipality, the other municipalities, the hospitals, all the basic infrastructure that is the civilian infrastructure, and the people who used to run all of that prior to October 7th were Hamas people. And, scores of thousands, I want to say, of Hamas functionaries in that civilian sector have either been killed or have been injured or otherwise. Their ability to run the municipalities, to organize food distribution systems, has been systematically targeted.
Yes, and you mentioned Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades. They work hand in hand with the current resistance. I think it's, to my understanding, they have actually dissociated themselves from the PA because they held on their conviction about resistance and therefore including armed resistance, and that's not one of the strategies that PA is currently adopting. And I mean, there are supporters of Fatah in Gaza. There are people, civilian people, part of the governance, that they get their salaries from the West Bank, which is the PA, while not doing much really in Gaza. And I know people there who actually are kind of part of, they believe in Fatah more than Hamas. But then when you look at the genocide, it doesn't really distinguish between whether it's Fatah, whether it's this household is Fatah, or this household is Hamas. Everyone is treated the same. Everyone is being exterminated and starved. And so whatever their political belongings, it's just, it's a war on Palestine.
On the people. Another thing that's worth noting, because I spent a lot of time as a journalist in Lebanon during the Civil War, is, so there, if you were Sunni Muslim, if you were Shia Muslim, then, there were certain kind of political affiliations that you would have. So you would kind of know if you go into a Greek Orthodox neighborhood that these would be the political trends there. In Palestinian society, it's very different. You have in the same family people who support Fatah, people who support Hamas, good brothers, cousins, and they come together for family meals, and then they go out and they disagree, but like the Rajoubs or the Shikakis or many famous families who have leaders from both parties. So it's very complicated.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of similar to the setup that we have here. I mean, I would vote for Greens. I, as an Australian, would vote for the Greens, and my brother would vote for the Labours. So it's very similar sentiments. My last question to you, which is interesting question and very common. What is the truth behind the often repeated claim that Netanyahu actually facilitated and even financed Hamas in Gaza as opposed to the Palestinian Authority?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something that is both out there and sort of used to discredit Hamas in certain circles. So I think, again, you know, from my perspective of having grown up in a decolonizing Britain, there is this thing called divide and rule, you know, that people need to remember, and that the Israelis have played, you know, like a piano, you know, that you strengthen these and you strengthen those, and you set these against those, and you end up, you know, with mass killings like India and Pakistan, or like, you know, northern Cyprus and southern Cyprus, or like Israel and Palestine. You know, divide and rule is a tried and true colonial tactic. So I think, you know, when Netanyahu saw that maybe the Americans were putting a little bit more pressure on him, he has to do something to give something to the PA, then he wants to build up Hamas with the idea that, oh, you know, so the PA is not so influential. He never, as far as I know, financed them himself from any, you know, Israeli government funds at all. He did permit the Qataris to send money in, and that was fairly evident. You know, so the Qataris sent money in, and it was used to build institutions, schools, universities, housing. I mean, remember that many of these facilities had to be rebuilt repeatedly after every single Israeli assault. That's one thing. Another thing is to remember that all those funds had to go in through Israel, and everything that was bought with them, if you're talking, you know, computers for a university, or facilities for a new bakery or whatever, has to be brought in through Israel. So the Israelis always make a really nice percentage out of all these reconstruction efforts. It's kind of the perfect Keynesian scheme, you know, that they make money from the military assaults, the weapons makers, and then after they've destroyed such a lot of things in Gaza, other traders and commercial interests make money from the reconstruction, because Gaza is a captive economy. It's not just a captive society. So anyway, long story short, yes, they allowed Qatari money to come in and to build many of the facilities that you're currently seeing being razed to the ground. So my concern is that when there's a ceasefire, the Israelis cannot be allowed to continue to control the reconstruction and to profit from the reconstruction in the way that they have with every single previous assault on Gaza. That is, you have to have the end of Gaza as a captive economy to Israel, which means you have to have the end of the Israeli occupation of Gaza. I mean, it just, otherwise we're going to see this happening again and again and again. That really, it was a bit of a divergence from the question, but the answer to the question is yes, the Israelis allowed the Qataris to send some money in, but they also made a lovely profit off it for themselves.
Absolutely. I like how you framed it, Helena, as a divide and conquer structure. I mean, to my understanding, it is that. And it's also, when it comes to the PA, for example, Israel is so content with the PA actually looking after the 2 million in the West Bank. And they've just created something similar in Gaza with the withdrawal decision in 2005. But then Hamas is kind of, the ideology of Hamas is very different. But Israel, as an occupying power, it doesn't want to look after the 2.3 million people in Gaza. They allowed the external funding for the government in Hamas, in Gaza, which is Hamas, to be flowing, to be sponsored by outsiders. And so in that case, they managed to pacify the West Bank, don't need to look to care about it. There's the UNRWA working in Gaza and the West Bank, and there's governance, kind of semi-governance in the two different Bantustans, I would say. But yeah, that's another reason for it. Did you want to add anything else, Helena, to that question, or in general?
No, I think, if anybody wants to go to justworldeducational.org, hope you can give them the hyperlink for that, and hope people buy the book from you, and they can buy the PDF, I think, from our publisher, or books. They can get information from here.
Absolutely.
And what else did I forget, Ahmed?
I can say a few words to remind you. Like Helena said, everyone, Just World Education is a brilliant resource.
Just World Educational.
No, educational. And Just World books as well. They have plenty of books. They have cookbooks that you just showed us, Helena. They have the brilliant book that I've purchased a few copies of. It's called Gaza Writes Back. And it's an amazing one. Just behind you, Helena, I can see it to your left. Again, I really want to thank everyone for joining us today. The recording of this conversation will be, the video recording will be sent out and made available on our YouTube channel, Palestine Justice Movement. Please follow us. I still have about 13 books. If anybody wants to get their copy, please reach out to info.pgms@gmail.com, or just, if you're in New South Wales or Sydney, find me at the rally tomorrow or any Sunday rally. Again, I want to thank everyone who's donated generously. This was supposed to be a free event, but people donated. So the money, I am in touch with the family in northern side of Gaza, and I have been sending them the money. It's been difficult to send the money, but I managed to send a few thousands there from the events that I've been holding. So please keep assisting, keep donating, and keep supporting, keep talking about Palestine. Thanks a lot, Helena.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Lovely meeting you too. Take care.
Bye then.
Good night.